Just say it, man. Don't make me ask 20 questions.
What is the point?
Get to the point.
Just say it already!
Welcome to the Podcram. Today we drop in on the Triggernometry podcast and get a lesson from Rafe Heydel-Mankoo on Western cultural history and British colonialism. I promise you, it's not as boring as it sounds.
And what is the genius of the West? What makes the West exceptional in your view?
What Rafe says next is the most fascinating explanation of Western culture we've ever heard on Triggernometry.
Well, it's fascinating. I mean, that requires another hour-long discussion, actually, because the Western mind is actually different to the non-Western mind. The Occidental mind, on many different levels. The genius of the West comes down to the fact that Westerners view the world differently. I mean, there's a chap called Joseph Heinrich who's written a book about this, The Weirdest People in the World. Weird means Western, educated, industrial, rich, and developed. And so, for example, Westerners or weird society people are very bad at facial recognition because we only use the right hemisphere for facial recognition, whereas non-Western cultures use both the left and the right. When it comes to memory, attention, spatial awareness, visual reasoning, there is a difference between both societies. Now, why is that? Well, he traces this back down to 1,000 years ago, to when the Western Church, later to become the Catholic Church, banned cousin marriages. Because up to that point, the whole world had clans and kinship based upon these large extended families where your first, second, third, fourth cousins were all deemed to be equal to brothers and sisters. And because of that, those clan societies were very much based upon nepotism, upon obedience to authority, upon conformity. What happened in the West is once you banned marriage between certain degrees of consanguinity, you got the birth of the nuclear family, which doesn't exist elsewhere. So 75% of the world still has cousin marriages. About 90% of the world doesn't have the same notion of the exclusive nuclear family that we have. And once you had the nuclear family devoid of its external connections to clanship, suddenly you got the birth of individuality and innovation, because the nuclear family then had to rely on contact with strangers. And the discerning feature of the West has been its levels of high social trust and its faith in their fellow neighbors. Can you trust somebody else? Will you actually help them in a moment of need and so forth? You don't find that in non-Western cultures. And this is a long way to answer your question,
no, please,
but I think it's...
Great. Take all the time, because this is the best bit. This is so fascinating. Please carry on.
And so what then happened is you had these individual nuclear families, and they then had to rely on others for different types of help and services. And people then began to choose occupations of their own choice for the first time. And through that, you then had people forming contracts with other people. Will you do this for me? And so you get the birth of contracts in Western culture. And they began to come together through guilds, the original sort of trade unions, to get together through confraternities, get together through the establishment of universities, and getting together through charter towns. Charter towns are towns that you have to apply to join, and you take an oath saying, I will live up to my responsibilities to help develop this. And once you have this cross-pollination between all of these different uniquely Western institutions arising, you get innovation. And social trust is intrinsically linked to economic prosperity and innovation. And individualism, of course, was core to this. That was the foundation for the uniqueness of the West, because it's not found anywhere else. And it was on that basis and on those building blocks that you began to see the development of a very different type of mentality, a very different type of view in the world. And you see evidence of it today. For example, if you look at notions of guilt. So guilt is very much a Western concept. It now expands because of industrialization. You find it in Japan and elsewhere, but it's something which when we do something bad, we feel guilty because we have let ourselves down as individuals. We haven't lived up to our own moral code. Elsewhere in the world, I mean, it's not black and white, right? There are gradations of this everywhere now, but it's shame that determines all of this. I have dishonored my family. Mm-hmm. Also, for example, if you ask a Westerner to identify themselves, they will use achievements and attributes. So you would say, I'm Francis, I'm a stand-up comedian, I'm an extroverted introvert, and I collect, milk bottle tops or whatever, right? You then
Nailed
ask
it.
you ask someone from in a area of Africa, for example, they will say, "Well, I'm X, I'm the son of Y, I'm the husband of Z, and I'm the father of so and so." So again, it's family connections that identify who the person is, and the Anglosphere particularly exploded as a birthplace of notions of liberty and the Industrial Revolution and so forth, also because of the rise of Protestantism. Because Protestantism separated or removed the priest from the equation, so people then had to read the Bible themselves. They had to become literate, and so the growth of literacy came out of Protestantism. And that's why you see the most individual countries in the world on the ranking. America and Canada are the most individualistic. Then it's Australia. Then it's the UK, and then it's the Scandinavian countries, which of course are also Protestant. And I find this theory of Joseph Heinrichs very, very compelling. And you can actually see it on a granular level. So if you look at Italy, for example, the Western Church's ban on cousin marriage was applied very rigorously in northern Italy, but not in southern Italy. Mm-hmm. And if you want to see the difference in the cultures between North and South Italy has a great deal of corruption. There's a reason why the Cosa Nostra, the mafia families came into an evolution there. It's fascinating to determine that even within the European context, let alone in the broader globally. So anyway, I would say that is the origins and reason for Western exceptionalism.
That is really, really fascinating.
But there's another point. This puts a big lie to the argument made now all the time that slavery was the source of the wealth of Britain and that the Industrial Revolution happened because of slavery. Mm-hmm. Now, if slavery was the driving force behind industrialization, you would have had Spain and Portugal as the great, powerful behemoths of the 18th and 19th centuries, instead of which they became economic backwaters, despite the fact that they had, Spain had 1/3 more slaves than Britain did. In the USA, of course, the southern states, which were the slave-owning states, didn't industrialize. It was the north of America that industrialized. Again, the point here is that people are always looking for a negative reason for the exceptionalism of the West. They're looking for a negative reason for why Britain industrialized. It couldn't have been because of Britain's genius that Britain became the first country to industrialize, that you had Watt and the great inventors and so forth. There has to be a sinister source for all of this privilege and wealth and genius that happened. And simply there's no evidence of it at all. Similarly, there's no evidence that, 1792 was the peak year for the sugar industry. And for Britain, in the slave trade, sugar was the most important commodity. Now, in 1792, sugar only accounted for 3% of British capital formation. So if sugar really was this huge economic, jewel in the crown, you would have had capital flowing into it from all sources. It should have been 30%, not 3%. In fact, we know now that the contribution of sugar to the British economy was the same as barley and hops. But you never get anyone saying that beer was the fueled the Industrial Revolution at all, do you? So again, we have to always look at the facts here, and the facts tell a very different story from the predominant narrative of our time.
And Rafe, we spend a lot of time in the US nowadays, and obviously the history of particularly slavery is very, very different because they had a lot of slaves living there, and still the people who are descended from those slaves live in their society today. I think objectively, I don't know whether you can trace it exactly as that, but I suspect you probably can, that those communities are very deprived when you see it with your own eyes when you travel around the United States. And you also see that people's subjective feelings about that issue, people are much more sensitive about that issue there, even than they are here in Britain. What can you tell us about the United States and the colonial Americas in terms of all of these issues?
It's undeniable that the chattel slavery in America was absolutely brutal and horrific. And I would say obviously anybody who was around in the 1860s would be absolutely entitled to claim reparations for the horrors, the absolute horrors of slavery. And much the same as in the British Caribbean islands. Slavery was horrific there. Has to be said at the same time that Black Americans are the wealthiest Black people in the world. I mean, so there is a lot of deprivation, obviously, but they still have the greatest amount of wealth of any element of the African diaspora. But the call now today, this whole idea of inherited trauma, for example. We're talking about 8 generations now. We're talking about the great grandchildren, and the whole issue of giving reparations or compensating people for the past is I don't think it holds any water, because reparations are fundamentally an issue of tort law. It's about putting the victim back into the position they would have been in had the trauma not occurred. But I don't see why you could actually say today that the lives of African Americans in America is actually worse than if they had never had their ancestors leave Africa. In 1973, I think it was 72, you had the rumble in the jungle when Muhammad Ali went to fight in Zaire. And he was asked by one of the journalists, he said, well, what do you think of Africa? He said, I'm so glad my granddaddy got on that boat. Right? Now, this is a black civil rights activist, right? Yeah. And, he could see the difference there. So, yeah, life is not great for everybody, but it's a hell of a lot better. I mean, for example, let's look at it this way. CARICOM, which is the organization in the Caribbean trying to get compensation from the British and the Americans, I think it's in the region of trillions of pounds they wanted compensation for slavery. I'm sorry, but the Caribbean nations are actually middle-income countries which rank higher on the Human Development Index than Brazil or Mexico. If you look, for example, the best way to do it is to compare the Caribbean to West Africa, which is where the slaves came from. So the annual GDP per capita in Benin is $1,400 approximately. In Barbados, it's 17,000. So we're talking about 10 times higher income. The life expectancy in Benin is 62. In Barbados, it's 79. So we're talking about 15 years more life, 10 times more money. So, as horrific as slavery was, and nobody is suggesting that slavery wasn't horrific, it's impossible for me to understand why anyone can say that the lives of people living in the Caribbean, living in this country, living in America are worse because their ancestors were enslaved. In fact, it's just the opposite, I would say. Look, no one is trying to put anything under the carpet. We must always expose, but the problem is we have too much focus on the negative and not enough focus on the good things that were done. And as I say, no civilization before had, as Western Europe had done, had been inspired to try to abolish an age-old custom of slavery. And in fact, it was not just slavery. I mean, if you look what the British Empire did, in India, they stopped sutti, the burning of Hindu women on funeral pyres. They stopped the infanticide of young girls. Well, they passed legislation to stop the infanticide of young girls. They allowed Hindu women to remarry. They stopped headhunting in New Zealand, tried to stop female genital mutilation in East Africa. You had, human sacrifices were carrying on. In the kingdom of Benin and Dahomey, there were annual sacrifices of slaves in the thousands. Still carries on today, unfortunately, in many countries in Africa, in Mozambique and Mali and elsewhere. You still get witchcraft-related human sacrifice taking place. The British were trying to abolish all of that. So, of course, there are huge stains on Britain's legacy, but there's also an immense amount of good that we should be celebrating, particularly, for example, if you're women, because women's rights around the world were hugely elevated by the presence of the British Empire in very patriarchal, very misogynistic cultures, such as India and so forth. And so the reason you have so many ethnic minority women in positions of power around the world is in large part because of the British Empire and, the creation of democratic legislatures across, 1/4 of the globe is thanks to Britain and the British Empire. And people like, Jinnah, the first leader of Pakistan, Nehru, first leader of India, they didn't want to get rid of the institutions and the structures that the British Empire had brought into those countries. They simply wanted to run them themselves. But they respected the inheritance that they had. And wherever you go in the world, in whatever region of the world you go to, those countries that were former British colonies are the ones that are most likely to be wealthy, stable, and democratic, and that's a great asset. And in fact, it's the legacy of the British Empire that has enabled many of these colonies to become global players. The English language, the common law, the infrastructure of the civil service, of the military, of the police, the hospitals that were built there by the British. There are so many good things that were done by colonialism. I often say that colonialism and capitalism, for all of their ills, nothing has done more to lift the world out of poverty than colonialism and capitalism. Now, that's something you can't say today, but that's the reality.
Rafe, so we've spoken and we've touched around the subject of myths and whatever else. What are these myths that we are being told and that we've been asked to swallow as a population?
Well, myths is a good term to use because all societies have their foundational myths, right? So, for example, we're in I live in London. That was supposedly founded by King Lud, after defeating the giants of Gog and Magog, and that linked us to the classical world when you had the idea of Brutus of Troy coming over. So those myths, provide an important sort of narrative and a fantasy story that gives a romance to history. What we're seeing now are new myths being created. So you have Sadiq Khan saying that London was built by immigrants, right? A complete nonsense given the fact that immigrants only started to arrive here in the post-war period, apart from the Irish, but the Irish are part of the British Isles. You had, Rishi Sunak producing a 50-pence coin saying diversity built Britain. Again, completely factually inaccurate to state that. You've got now BBC, for example, putting out this book, Horrible Histories, that claims that black sub-Saharan Africans have been present in Britain for a millennia. You have The Guardian claiming that Roman emperors were black. These are the myths that we're being told, that Nelson was in favour of slavery on the basis of one single letter, which is now proved to have been edited after his death. And of course, you have the war and the attack on essentially every single hero that symbolizes, in my view, the great maverick spirit of the British. So, be it Nelson, be it Drake, be it Churchill. These are the myths. The myths that we have in our society today are targeted merely at undermining, I think, the foundations for Britain's pride in itself, in its accomplishments and its achievements, and in the heroism of its figures.
But we also have to acknowledge, for instance, everyone can take a drink. My mother's Venezuelan. And the way that people in South America look at Francis Drake isn't particularly favourable. So there's two sides, if we're being fair.
With Drake, there certainly is, but there's the idea that there are no redeeming qualities. It's very much, you can call it, generational chauvinism. The idea that we're going to judge everyone in the past by today's standards. Now, some people come out better of that. Drake is not one of the most enlightened figures, even by his own time. But there's certainly a lot to admire about the man, especially when you consider him within the context of his time. And indeed, the existence of slavery today, where the International Labour Organization says that 7 in every 1,000 Africans today is a slave. That's 10 million people. CNN reported hundreds of slaves are sold every week in Libya. And the kids simply couldn't accept this. And it's because of the fact that they're being taught a very, very narrow and biased view of history. And I would have much more time for these academics who are spouting this nonsense about Britain and the slave trade if they were equally vocal about what I've just said. If they were actually protesting outside, high commissions and embassies around the world. Cameroon has 800,000 slaves, Niger, Nigeria, Mali, Mozambique. And yet they're silent about that. And you would have thought that the lives and the plight of people alive today is far more important than worrying about the historic slavery which happened 8 generations ago. That's why we know that this actually isn't about colonialism. This isn't about slavery. If it was, we would have exactly the points that you're being made by the activists who are so keen to undermine Britain's role in history.
Well, what we're talking about here really is the obliteration of a culture, aren't we? And if you don't have a homogenous culture, then you don't have a society.
Precisely. Well, that is the long march through the institutions.
One of the things I've never really understood is why historians have gone along with this. I read this brilliant book called The People's History of Britain. I don't remember but it was a female author. And I read it, I swallowed it, inhaled it in a couple of days. It was fantastic. And I then was like, I want to read more of these. So I went online and I bought a book called The People's History of America or the United States by a guy called Howard Zinn. And I read it for about 2 chapters and I wanted to throw up in the bin, and I ended up putting the book in the bin because it was just this one-sided, America is all evil. There was no balance. There was no attempt to present any objective view of history. But it seems to me like historians, you said it yourself, history departments at universities are absolutely filled with people who think in this way. How's that happen? Because historians are supposed to be the custodians of the past, aren't you?
You see kids wearing Che Guevara t-shirts. Che Guevara was a rabid homophobe who executed gay people despised them.
And a racist as well.
Yeah.
As was Karl Marx, a huge racist. You know, you'll have Churchill being condemned as a racist. Churchill never used the N-word. He very rarely used any racial epithets, actually. In all the millions of words we have about him, he never once used the N-word, for example. Karl Marx was using it seemingly almost every day if you read his letters to Engels and so forth.
He might have been a fan of hip-hop, right?
But there's a difference between mass immigration and immigration, right? So what we had in the 80s and 90s was 50,000 a year, right? We had more immigration last year than the entire decade of the 1980s combined. You know, we've had more immigration in the last 25 years than in the last 2,000 years. So the idea that you can integrate such large numbers of people is simply impossible. And we had iconic British role models who were black or Asian, right? You had Daley Thompson, you had Tessa Sanderson, Linford Christie, you know, you had Freddie Mercury. Nobody saw them through the prism of race. They were all British, right? Now everything that we're seeing is through the prism of race. And that's been the most destructive aspect of what we're seeing right now in our society.
Thanks for listening to this installment of The Podcram. I hope it contains something useful for you. If you enjoy these selections and are curious about the curator's own thoughts, you can check out my other podcast, Psychic Lube, where I share concise concepts meant to grease the intellectual gears and help get your creative juices flowing. Each episode is an ongoing collaborative project that welcomes listeners to expand or rebut its points by email or comment, the most interesting of which get incorporated through periodic re-recordings. As always, if you're intrigued by today's content, I encourage you to go listen to the full podcast in its original form directly from its creators so that their sponsors keep paying them to make stuff for us and nobody feels compelled to sue me for copyright infringement. Now, get off your phone and go do smart stuff. Have a productive day.